It is my privilege to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. George Hillman. Dr. George Hillman Jr. serves as Vice President for Education and Professor of Educational Ministries and Leadership at Dallas Theological Seminary. George came to DTS with years of pastoral experience in churches and parachurch organizations in Texas and Georgia. A graduate of Texas A&M, a graduate of Texas A&M, thank you, and Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. George has a passion for education, spiritual formation, and leadership development. He is an enthusiastic college football fan, and he loves really good barbecue. He's married to his wife, Jana, who is here tonight. Would you please wave that we can see you? Thank you for being here tonight. And they have one grown daughter who they just put on a plane for Italy, who is now there embarking upon a career in the arts. George, I want to say on a personal note what a joy it is to get to work with you. You bring great joy to the campus. Joy and volume, but mostly joy to the campus of Dallas Theological Seminary, and your impact is great, brother. It is a privilege to serve with you. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. George Hillman here tonight?
Thank you, Mark. Well, next month, season 2 of The Mandalorian comes out. Now, let me go on and tell you, the minute I say Mandalorian, I know my audience has split into 3 different categories. 1/3 of you say, Manda who? Don't worry about it. I'm going to explain it very quickly to you who have no idea what I'm getting ready to talk about. For 1/3 of you, you're going, I don't get it. That's okay. I will pray for your soul. But I will make sure that this illustration connects with you. But then there's 1/3 of you that when I say Mandalorian, your 10-year-old geek Star Wars just rises to the surface. Do I have those people in this room? Yes, thank you very much. I say 10 years old because I was 10 years old when Star Wars came out, the very first one. I still have my Star Wars lunchbox. I still have the Star Wars action figures, and my new phone cover is a Star Wars phone cover. Now, old school Star Wars, 1977, none of this new Disney Plus stuff, but The Mandalorian. It is a new television series on Disney Plus, and basically, in a nutshell, it is a space Western about a bounty hunter that has been sent to bring back a target, dead or alive. Well, now, if you've watched the show, you know who the target is. It's Baby Yoda. And let me tell you very quickly about the Mandalorian and Baby Yoda. At the end of the very first episode, you realize that this guy right here is the target that he's going after, and you can't shoot Baby Yoda. You've got to bring him back alive. And for the rest of the episodes, let's just be real honest, the show's about Baby Yoda. Now, the show is called The Mandalorian, but the show, why you watch week after week, it's for Baby Yoda and what Baby Yoda's going to do. And for the rest of the episodes in season 1, the Mandalorian, he, as the bounty hunter, is basically the chauffeur for this little fella. And they go across the universe and have all kinds of wonderful adventures. So I'm going to set Baby Yoda up there for a second. A secondary character comes onto the storyline and radically changes the story. That's a common storytelling technique. You know, you'll have a main character and the wise old sage comes in and gives the words of wisdom that main character needed right at that moment. The main character is in peril and the secondary character comes in and rescues the main character. Sometimes even the secondary character gives his or her life for the main character to rescue the main character. And very quickly you realize that even though the story says that the story is about this, because of a secondary character, the story changes. And that's what we're going to be talking about as we look at a miracle account with Jesus. We'll set Baby Yoda over there so he won't be quite as distracting. But if you get bored, you can just look at his cuteness and it's all covered. Here's what happens in the miracle accounts in the Gospels. What you will find is that you will find Jesus showing up in incredibly desperate situations. And he changes everything. Think about these things: illness, blindness, deafness, bleeding, leprosy, paralysis, demon possession, storms. The person in that moment has no way of getting out of the situation. And then Jesus shows up. And here's your big idea. When Jesus shows up, he changes everything. He changes everything. And sometimes we think we're the main character in our life. We're not the main character in the story. Jesus is the one that changes the storyline for all of us. We're going to be in Luke chapter 7. So scroll, turn, whatever you need to do to get to Luke chapter 7. And we're going to be in verses 11 through 17. Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. But as you're turning there, let me give you a real quick recap of the miracles of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke up to this point. In Luke chapter 4, we see Jesus at a synagogue in Capernaum on the Sabbath, preaching a message, and in the middle of the message, a demon-possessed man stands up, and Jesus delivers this demon-possessed man. Now, it is the Sabbath, and so there's travel restrictions there. So literally, Jesus walks across the street on the Sabbath to Peter's mother's house, and she has a high fever, and he heals her of the high fever. As soon as the sun goes down, there are people lined up out the door at the house because they know Jesus has shown up. And remember what our big idea is: when Jesus shows up, he changes everything. So when Jesus shows up in town, people know this is a man that can change everything in my life. In Luke chapter 5, we see Jesus healing a man who has had a debilitating case of leprosy. We see a man who is a paralytic, and he is being lowered down through the roof by his friends because they know when Jesus shows up that he changes everything. And then in Luke chapter 6, we see Jesus healing a withered hand. And at the start of Luke chapter 7, we see Jesus even healing a Roman centurion. Let me say it again. A Roman centurion's servant from near death. Miracle, 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 miracle. You see that in the gospel account of Luke. You see that in all four gospel accounts. But you haven't seen anything yet to what you're going to see with the miracle in Luke 7, starting in verse 11. So Luke 7, starting 11 through 13, it says, soon afterwards, he, Jesus, went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. And as he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother. And she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Soon after, we know, like I just said, at the first of Luke chapter 7, he's in Capernaum, and he's healed the centurion's servant. He's traveled about 25 miles south to this little bitty town that doesn't mean a hill of squat. And Jesus shows up, and he shows up to the most tragic thing that you could possibly imagine. Let me introduce you to the characters. Here's character number one. It's a young man. It's a young man who has died. And young men are not supposed to die in their prime. They're not. Now, we don't know what happened, if it was an illness. We don't know if it was an accident on the farm. But here's a young man in his prime of life who has died. And we know that in Jewish customs that this would have happened that morning. They're not going to wait a couple of days for the funeral. So the emotions are raw. They're real. No one has time to process what's going on. So character number one is this dead man who is being carried out on a stretcher. He would have been wrapped and he would have been anointed to be carried out before sundown. Character number two is the widowed mother. Her son just died that morning. She's had no time to process any of the emotions that she's going through right now. And she's a widow. Her husband has died previously. She has absolutely no economic means whatsoever. And for the rest of her life, she is going to be dependent on the charity of her neighbors. That's a desperate situation. We've got a dead young man who faced a tragic death that morning, and you've got a widowed mother leading the procession. Now, there's a considerable crowd that shows up as well. These are the neighbors, these are the friends in this little bitty town, podunk town in the middle of nowhere, and they want to love on her. They want to be there for her. They want to support her, and that's so good that they are there. But if you've ever been the person who has sat on the cold folding chair at the graveside, you know that this is something you face alone. And the people can be around and the friends can be around, but you're facing this alone. So we've got a dead young man, we've got a widowed mother, and we've got this crowd that is around. But a secondary figure shows up in the story, and it's Jesus. What you see in the account, it says that Jesus had compassion. That word compassion, that means gut-wrenching. I mean, hit in the stomach, gut-wrenching. The compassion of Jesus, we see this throughout. Compassion for widows, compassion for the outcast, compassion for the suffering, compassion for the grieving. That is found all throughout the other gospel accounts. What's very interesting is that in the Gospel of Luke, Luke actually uses that term very rarely. So as you're reading the account of Luke, compassion should just hit you like a tin of bricks. Because Jesus shows up on the scene and he has compassion. And he walks up to this lady. I'm going to use a little bit of pastoral license right now. I think he pushes the crowd away and he takes this precious lady and he says, "Do not weep. Do not weep." Now here's the disciples. The disciples are along the side and they're coming along. They're going, "Oh, isn't that sweet?" Jesus is showing this compassion and this love. He has taken time in this funeral to tell her, "Woman, please don't weep." And they're thinking, and he's going to move on and go on to the next scene because there's something else they're going. This is a little podunk town in the middle of nowhere, and this can't be all that there is. But here's where the twist to the story comes in. Verses 14 and 15. It says, then Jesus came up and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Jesus, we would have said, "Oh, that is so wonderful. You showed compassion to this mother who's just lost her son, and you said the right words that were spoken." And Jesus says, "No, I'm here to fix the situation," because when Jesus shows up, he changes everything. And what happens is that social conventions of that time and religious rules and regulations of the time said, you don't touch a dead body. That makes you ceremonially unclean. And Jesus says, "I don't care." And he comes up and touches the dead body. And the people carrying the dead body, they're like, "Oh my gosh, what just happened?" And they stand still because no one does that. This is so out of character. He says, "Get up." And the dead man sits up and speaks. Let me say that one more time. The dead man sits up and speaks. Because when Jesus shows up, he changes everything. He changes everything. And why is Jesus able to do this? It's because Jesus has the authority and the power over the greatest enemy in this world, and that is death. And he gives this young man who is dead, who had died that morning, and he gives this young man back to his mother. And the mother's crying. But it's no longer a cry of tears of sadness. These are just uncontrollable tears of joy. Verses 16 and 17. It says, fear seized them all. That's an understatement if there ever was one. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people. And this report about him spread throughout all of Judea and the surrounding countryside. We're going to see a couple words there. Fear. Fear is what happens when you, as a mere mortal, come face to face with something that you can't coerce, you can't control, you can't figure out, you can't fathom. When you come face to face with something that is totally and completely beyond you, of course you're going to be fearful as a result of that. This is one of those favorite words that Luke says, that any time when the divine shows up, something that is completely out of the ordinary, that there's fear that's there. But there's also fear and glory. So there's fear, the great fear that's there, but then they're also glorifying God. And this is another great expression that you find throughout Luke, that there's fear, but there's always glorifying of God that takes place after that. And it's the natural reaction as well when you realize that you are face to face with the divine. See, fear is when you're face to face with something you can't control. But when you're face to face with something you can't control and you know that that person is Jesus, it automatically goes to worship. And then the people said, man, there's a great prophet that's among us. And God must have visited us. Well, let me give you a little bit of geography. If you've ever been to Israel, as you're driving down the highway, down the Jezreel Road, you're going to see on the left-hand side a little hill. They call it a mountain. It's a hill called Moreh. And on one side of that hill is this little village. And on the other side of that very same hill is another little town that when you look back into the Old Testament, into 2 Kings chapter 4, you see that Elisha performed a very similar miracle. And we're going to talk about, but there's a difference in that miracle. But a very similar miracle took place, same neighborhood, just around the hill, where Elisha raises the only son of a couple. Now we know, and when you go back just a little bit further to 1 Kings 17, and you go up the coast to the Phoenician coast, you're going to see Elijah do the exact same type of miracle. Now Elijah's miracle is almost verbatim this miracle. He meets a widow. The widow is at the town gate. She's lost her only son. Elijah raises the young man and then gives the raised son back to the widow. Almost the exact same wording. And as this is going on in this town, this day, in this most tragic event, trust me, everyone that was there that day immediately connected the dots. They connected the dots with Elisha because that was the same neighborhood. That was a couple hundred years before, but trust me, when somebody comes back from the dead, it's talked about for a while. And they see Elijah and Elisha, and they see these things, and they make the connection. They say, oh my goodness, this must be another prophet like Elijah and Elisha. Oh, but Jesus is so much more than just a prophet. See, Elijah and Elisha, they were conduits through which the power of God flowed. And when you actually read those accounts of Elijah and Elisha, it takes them a little bit of effort. If you know a little bit about the story, it's not just an instantaneous thing. Jesus goes up to this woman and says, woman, do not weep. I mean, a little bit more license. Woman, I'm going to give you something else to cry about in just a second because I'm going to go up and say, young man, get up. Yeah. And then hands it back to the mother, and the mother just loses it. Because when Jesus shows up, He changes everything. And here's the thing is that Jesus is able to just speak the words and life appears. Now it says God has visited his people. I want to be very clear. These people that saw this miracle did not have a robust Christology that day. They just knew something happened that involved God. I don't think they saw Christ as the Son of God, the second member of the triune Godhead, but they realized that this was a miracle in the absolute truest sense of the word. And the reports spread. The reports spread throughout Judea, and it says it even reached into the surrounding countryside. And how do we know that? We know that because when you read just a little bit further, we're going to read about John the Baptist, who's going to hear this very same report, and he's across the Jordan River. Man, when Jesus shows up, he changes everything, and people cannot wait to share the news. So as we unpack this, I want to talk about three things. Number one is compassion. Our world needs compassion right now. Jesus enters into this emotional, messy situation and changes it. Jesus is God. Jesus did not have to walk up and touch a dead body. Jesus could have just said, hey, you get up, and it would have happened. But there's something about touch. And again, this idea of, I truly think he touched this woman and said, please don't weep, because I'm getting ready to fix this thing for you. There's compassion that's there, and there's compassion that our world is hungry for. We've got the words of life. We've got the words that the world is looking for. So there's compassion of Jesus. There's power of Jesus. Jesus walks up and speaks, and life happens. Because when Jesus shows up, he changes everything. John chapter 5, verses 25 through 29. Let me just read this to you. This comes after another miracle. And Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who have done good to a resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to a resurrection of judgment. See, there will come a day when Jesus comes back, and when he comes back, he changes everything. And there's going to come a day, we see a preview of this happening here. We see a greater preview of this that happens with his own resurrection, and there will be a day when resurrection happens. And that brings us to the third, which is the response. When we understand the compassion of Jesus, we understand the power of Jesus, the response to Jesus. See, Jesus deals with the ultimate enemy. And I know you know this. But if we don't have the resurrection, we don't have squat. Everything that you're holding on to is based on the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the death, burial, and resurrection. And the gospel of Jesus is the gospel that offers hope. Yeah. True hope. Yeah. And here's the thing, is that you've got that hope. And that's what the world wants to hear, is the hope that's found in Jesus. One of the really strange, I'm going to use the word blessings, and I'm going to put that in quotes, but one of the really strange blessings of COVID has been that we have more people now watching chapel than have ever watched chapel ever in their entire lives. So while our numbers here can sometimes be small, there's thousands of you who are watching us online. I mean, thousands. And so I would be remiss with literally a global audience to not share the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. See, as this story illustrates, we're dead. We have no hope. We have no life without Jesus. But see, I know that when Jesus shows up, he changes everything. And Jesus, through his own death, burial, and resurrection, has taken our sin and he's taken our death and he gives us life. And it's a gift, it's a free gift. You can't earn it. Just as this dead man could not get off of the plank, we can't save ourselves. We can't bring life back. But because Jesus has the authority and Jesus has the power, Jesus brings to life those things that are dead. And so if you've never come to a point of trusting in Jesus and Jesus Christ alone for your salvation, I have a very simple prayer that I'd love for you to bow. And as I said, I know people are watching on Facebook. I know people that are watching on YouTube. And even in your homes, no matter where you are in the world, it's a very simple prayer. It's, dear God, I know that I'm a sinner. I know that my sin deserves death, but I believe Jesus died for me and rose from the grave. And I trust Jesus alone as my Savior. Thank you for the forgiveness and the everlasting life that I now have. And in Jesus' name, I ask these things. Amen. If you're watching this and you have just prayed to trust in Jesus and Jesus alone for your salvation, we would love to hear from you because we would love to put you with a great Bible-believing church no matter where you are around the world. The wonderful thing about Dallas Theological Seminary is that there's probably a DTS alum somewhere in the world where you're located, and we would love to get you connected with them so you can start growing in your own faith. And for the rest of you, you have got the words of life. See, when Jesus shows up, he changes everything. Jesus wants you to show up so that he can use you to change everything that's around you. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for showing up in our lives. We were not looking for you. We were dead and we were hopeless. Oh, but Jesus, you showed up. And when you show up, you change everything. For those who have placed their faith in you, Jesus, I rejoice in the new life that just sprung forth this evening. And for us who live in the life found in Jesus, may we show up and let you change